The morning mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, and Father Marcus could feel the weight of sorrow pressing against his chest before he even saw the mourners gathering. St. Helena's Cemetery had witnessed countless farewells, but something about this day felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, broken only by the distant sound of weeping and the soft rustle of autumn leaves. Margaret Thornfield's funeral was meant to be small, just family and a few close friends from the wildlife sanctuary where she had devoted 30 years of her life. The elderly woman had passed peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a legacy of rescued animals and countless stories of impossible bonds between humans and creatures most people feared. As Father Marcus approached the graveside, adjusting his collar against the cool October breeze, he noticed the mourners seemed unusually tense. Their eyes kept darting toward the tree line that bordered the cemetery's eastern edge. Margaret's nephew, David, stood rigid beside the casket, his wife, Sarah, clutching his arm with white knuckles. "Father," David whispered as the priest drew near, "there's something you should know. We've been hearing strange sounds from the woods all morning. Aunt Margaret always said—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." Father Marcus had known Margaret for over a decade. She had been one of those rare souls who seemed to speak a language that transcended species. Her small sanctuary had housed everything from injured owls to abandoned wolf cubs, and she treated each creature as if it were her own child. The stories people told about her bordered on the mystical, how she could calm a panicking horse with a whisper, or how wild birds would perch on her shoulders as she walked through town. The service was scheduled to begin at 10, and as the small group of mourners settled into their folding chairs, Father Marcus opened his prayer book. The words of comfort he had spoken hundreds of times before felt heavier today, weighted with the knowledge that Margaret had died alone, with only the memory of her beloved animals for company. "We gather today to celebrate the life of Margaret Rose Thornfield," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "A woman who understood that love knows no boundaries, that compassion—" A low sound rolled across the cemetery, deep and resonant. Father Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. The mourners had gone completely still, their attention fixed on something behind him. Slowly, he turned. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the morning shadows, stood a massive lion. The creature was magnificent and terrifying, its golden mane catching fragments of sunlight that filtered through the canopy. But what struck Father Marcus most was not the lion's size or unexpected presence. It was the way the animal stood, with its great head lowered and its powerful shoulders shaking with what could only be described as grief. Sarah Thornfield gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, it's Leo." "That's impossible," David whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Leo died 3 years ago. We were there when Margaret—" The lion took a step forward, and the mourners instinctively drew back. But Father Marcus found himself rooted in place, unable to look away from the creature's eyes. They were amber and ancient, filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and they were wet with tears. Father Marcus had served in parishes across 3 states over his 25-year career. He had witnessed miracles that defied explanation and sorrows that challenged faith. But he had never seen an animal cry, not like this, with the deliberate, conscious grief of someone saying goodbye to a beloved friend. The lion moved with careful, measured steps toward Margaret's casket. The mourners parted like water, some weeping, others paralyzed with awe and terror. David started to move forward, perhaps to protect the others, but his wife caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Look at him, David. Really look." The lion approached the casket and lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched the polished wood. A sound emerged from deep in his chest, not a roar, but something softer, more heartbroken. It was the sound of mourning, primal and pure. Father Marcus felt his prayer book trembling in his hands. In all his years of ministry, he had spoken often about the interconnectedness of all God's creatures, but it had always been theological theory. This was something else entirely, a demonstration of love that transcended everything he thought. He understood about the natural world. The lion remained at the casket for several long minutes, his massive frame shuddering with each breath. Then slowly he lifted his head and looked directly at Father Marcus. The priest felt as if those amber eyes were seeing straight through to his soul, asking a question he couldn't quite understand. "Father?" David's voice was barely audible. "Aunt Margaret rescued Leo when he was just a cub. His mother had been killed by poachers and he was dying when the Wildlife Service brought him to her. She bottle-fed him, slept beside his enclosure when he was sick, taught him to hunt when he was old enough. When he reached maturity, she knew she had to let him go. It nearly broke her heart, but she drove him deep into the national forest and released him." The lion's gaze never left Father Marcus as David continued his story. She always believed he would come back someday. Every year on his birthday, she would drive to that same spot in the forest and leave a gift, usually his favorite, treats from when he was young. She'd sit there for hours talking to the trees as if he could hear her. We thought it was just wishful thinking, an old woman's way of dealing with loss. Father Marcus slowly closed his prayer book. The traditional words of comfort seemed inadequate in the face of such raw, honest grief. He looked at the assembled mourners, then back at the lion, and made a decision that would challenge his understanding of ministry for the rest of his life. "Margaret always told me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, "that love is the one force in this universe that recognizes no boundaries. She believed that every creature, human and animal alike, carries within them the capacity for profound connection, for loyalty that transcends death itself." The lion's ears pricked forward at the sound of Margaret's name. She used to say that the angels in heaven probably have paws and wings and fins, because God's love is too big to be contained in just one form. Looking at our friend here today, I think Margaret might have been onto something. Father Marcus took a step closer to the lion, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the mourners behind him. "You loved her too, didn't you, boy? You remember her voice, her kindness. You've carried her in your heart all these years in the wild, just as she carried you in hers." The lion's tail, which had been still, began to twitch, not with aggression, but with something that looked remarkably like recognition. "Margaret knew you would come," Father Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She told me once that real love never dies, that it finds a way to express itself even when we think all hope is lost. She said that if there was any way for her animal friends to say goodbye, they would find it. They would find it." The lion took another step forward, close enough now that Father Marcus could see the silver threading through his golden mane, the small scars that spoke of years in the wild, the deep intelligence in those remarkable eyes. Without thinking, the priest extended his hand. "She's at peace now," he whispered. "She's with all the ones she couldn't save, all the creatures she loved who went before her, and she knows you came to say goodbye." The lion sniffed Father Marcus's outstretched hand, then gently pressed his massive head against the priest's palm. The contact lasted only a moment, but in that brief touch, Father Marcus felt something he had never experienced before, a communication that needed no words, a sharing of grief that transcended species. When the lion stepped back, he turned once more toward Margaret's casket. He opened his mouth and released a sound that was part roar, part song, a farewell that seemed to echo off the headstones and roll across the hills beyond the cemetery. It was a sound of love, of loss, of gratitude for a woman who had saved his life and set him free. Then, as quietly as he had come, the lion turned and walked back toward the forest. He paused at the edge of the tree line and looked back once, his gaze finding Father Marcus again. In that final look, the priest saw something that would stay with him forever. Not just intelligence or grief, but what could only be called blessing. The lion disappeared into the shadows between the trees, leaving behind a cemetery full of mourners who had witnessed something that would change their understanding of love, loss, and the mysterious connections that bind all living things. Father Marcus stood in the silence that followed, his prayer book forgotten in his hands. When he finally found his voice again, the words that came were not from any liturgy he had memorized, but from his heart. Margaret always said that love is the one miracle we can count on, the one force that makes sense of everything else. Today, we've seen that love in action, not just in our memories of a remarkable woman, but in the presence of a friend who traveled from the depths of the forest to honor her memory. He looked around at the tear-streaked faces before him, at Margaret's simple casket surrounded by flowers, at the place where the lion had stood. There are mysteries in this world that our minds cannot fully grasp, but our hearts recognize instinctively. What we witnessed today was one of those mysteries, a love so pure and so strong that it called a wild creature from his domain to stand among us and grieve for a woman who changed his life with her kindness. David Thornfield stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Father, how do we make sense of this? How do we explain what just happened?" Father Marcus smiled, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't expected. "We don't explain it, David. We simply accept it as a gift. A reminder that the love Margaret showed to every creature she met was real, was powerful, and continues even now. That lion didn't come here by accident. He came because love called him, because gratitude called him, because Margaret's spirit somehow reached across the divide between this world and whatever comes next to bring him here for this moment." As they lowered Margaret's casket into the earth, Father Marcus offered a prayer unlike any he had spoken before, one that included not just the human mourners, but all the creatures Margaret had touched throughout her life, and especially the magnificent lion who had honored her with his presence and his tears. Later, as the mourners dispersed and the cemetery returned to its peaceful quiet, Father Marcus remained behind. He stood at Margaret's graveside, thinking about the extraordinary mourning, about the lion's tears, about the way love could manifest in forms that defied every expectation. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers on the grave, and for just a moment, Father Marcus could have sworn he heard the faint sound of laughter, Margaret's laughter carried on the wind like a blessing. He smiled, gathered his things, and walked toward his car, knowing that he would never again underestimate the power of love to work miracles, or the depth of connection possible between all God's creatures. In the forest beyond the cemetery, a lion paused in his journey home and looked back once more toward the place where an extraordinary woman lay at rest. Then he lifted his great head toward the sky and roared, not in grief now, but in celebration of a love that death could not diminish, a bond that would endure long after the last flower on Margaret's grave had withered away.